Welcome to Rambam in Depth. Today we're going to be discussing the Rambam Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh, Perek Tes, Halacha Aleph. The Rambam says as follows: Shnas Hachama yesh mechach misor she'emim shishasa yayim v'reviya yayim shehu sheishois. A solar year, some of our sages say, is 365 and a quarter days, a quarter being 6 hours. That's one opinion. V'yesh mehen she'emrim shu pachas m'reviya hayim. Other sages say that it's less than a quarter of a day, less than 6 hours. These two opinions the Rambam mentions here anonymously reflect the two opinions in the Gemara between Shmuel and Rav Ada. Shmuel is the one who says that it's 365 and a quarter, and Rav Ada is the one who says it's 365 and a little bit less than a quarter of the day. Now, why is it important to know that there are two opinions? In what way do we recognize both opinions? So if you look in the Rambam, it seems that the Rambam adopted both opinions, and that's the halacha as well. For example, in Perek Yud, next chapter, Halacha Vav, the Rambam says that when it comes to making a leap year, an Iber Hashana, when Bezdin has to determine whether you should add an extra month, why? To accommodate Pesach. And Pesach should occur within the spring because the Torah not only makes Pesach based on a lunar calendar, the 15th of Nisan, but it also has to be in the spring, which is a solar phenomenon. And therefore, he says that we rely on the opinion, the second opinion of Ada, that because he says Lefisha Cheshbon Zehu Emes Yosem in Harishan, that this calculation is more true than the first. That means that the Rambam is saying, and this is how the Rabbi infers from this statement, that the Rambam holds that both are true, both are emes, except one is more emes than the other. And it raises some questions. Question number one that the Rebbe raises in a talk that he gave in the year Tafshin Yud Gimel, I believe it was in conjunction with Birchas Hachama, the blessing we say over the sun every 28 years. Now, the Rebbe asked the question, according to the opinion of Shmuel, the first opinion, it would seem that there's a little bit of a problem. Because although, according to Shmuel, there'd be no problem with the month of Nisan and the season of the spring, that part of the month of Nisan would always occur in the spring to beyond the year 6000. So that's no problem. But there's another problem, because it's not enough that Nisan, the month of Nisan, the lunar month of Nisan, occurs in the spring. Pesach, which is the 15th day of the month, also has to occur in the spring, and that doesn't work according to Shmuel. It only works according to Rav Ada. So the question is, why are we even considering the opinion of Shmuel? But not only are we considering it, we're following it lahalacha. When it comes to calculating the machzor, the cycle of the sun, and we say the blessing when we see the sun every 28 years, we go according to the calculation of Shmuel, not Rav Ada. According to Rav Ada, that would not be the time when the cycle begins. Why would we be following Rav Shmuel, which the Rambam himself says is not as emes? It's emes, but not as emes as Rav Ada. When we need a Rav Ada, Shmuel will only satisfy one need, that the month of Nisan should occur in the spring, but it doesn't satisfy the need for Pesach to occur in the spring. Sometimes it'll happen that Pesach will not be in the spring. It'll be a few days before the spring season. That's one very powerful question that the Rebbe asks. And the answer the Rebbe gives, and also there are other halachas that are associated with the tkufa, with the changing of seasons, according to Shmuel. For example, when do we ask for rain outside of Eretz Yisrael? When do we say V'sein talamata levracha? So it says in Shulchan Aruch, we do that 60 days after the change of seasons. Well, when is the season? We follow the opinion of Shmuel. Why do we follow the opinion of Shmuel when that is not this astronomical reality? Because we follow the opinion of Rav Ada. So the Rebbe explains that when we talk about the concept of calculations, we find a similar phenomenon with regard to sanctifying the new moon, Kiddush Hachodesh. Every month we sanctify the new moon. How was it done? In the days that we didn't follow a calendar, we would be Mekadesh based on Riyah, on the sighting of the moon. So our sages tell us what happens if the Bezdin errs and they declare the wrong day to be Rosh Chodesh, or they do even that intentionally. Atem afilu mizidim, you have the power to declare Rosh Chodesh even when it's not actually the molad, the birth of the new moon. How could that be? How could we go by the molad, the birth of the moon, and not go by the actual reality of the birth of the moon? So the Rebbe says when we talk about these concepts of the sun and the moon and the celestial bodies, and when we cite them, there's the parallel, what we see down here in this physical world, up there in the heavens. And the molad of the moon usually occurs at the time that it can be visible physically to us. But there are times when we're not in alignment with what's going on up there. And sometimes the moon, the molad, the birth of the moon occurs not when it happens down here in the physical world. And how do we know when the real molad is? It's whenever the Bezdin declares Rosh Chodesh, that is when the real molad happens, because not everything down here is in alignment with everything up there. And similarly, the Rebbe says, the same thing over here with the Tkufa, with the seasons and the cycle of the 28-year machzor. He says sometimes it could happen that, or it does happen, that what happens up there doesn't translate the way it is down here. And in that case, we follow the opinion of Shmuel, because the reality is not always the same down here as it is up there. The Rebbe says, but there's a problem. The analogy to Rosh Chodesh is not a perfect analogy. Why? Because Rosh Chodesh is inherently and essentially a Torah concept. Rosh Chodesh is a day of holiness. It's a day when special sacrifices have to be brought. So when you're dealing with a concept of halacha, you can understand how we don't go by what our physical eyes see necessarily, but by the reality, the way it is in a higher world, in a halacha world, you could say. Sometimes that halacha world translates in our physical reality, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be real. But when you're talking about a physical phenomenon of the cycles of the sun, when you're dealing with seasons that are physical phenomena, how could it be that we don't go by what we see down here in our reality? We go by what is there in a spiritual reality when these are physical phenomena. Moreover, the Rebbe asks, when we make the bracha on the sun every 28 years, the halach is we have to see the sun. But we're not seeing it in its birth because it doesn't really happen then, according to the opinion of Shmuel that we follow. So the Rebbe explains that there's a dispute in the Gemara between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. When was the world created? Rabbi Yeshua says in Nisan, Rabbi Eliezer says in Tishrei. There's a reconciliation of these two views, that Rabbi Yeshua, who says it was created in Nisan, means b'machshava. It was created in God's thought in Nisan, and in actuality, it was created in Tishrei. That means from Nisan till Tishrei, there was a creation in a spiritual sense. It's called the year of Tohu, the year of chaos. There was no reality the way we know it. It was a higher type of reality. And since we follow that opinion of Rabbi Yeshua, the Rebbe explains, therefore, when it comes to the matters concerning the seasons, we go by a higher reality, not by the physical reality down here. And therefore, we do follow the opinion of Shmuel. So now we understand why when it comes to the holiday of Pesach, we have to go by the reality, the way it is, according to Rav Ada. When we're talking about the seasons, we go by this higher reality. But then the Rebbe says it doesn't make sense. Why is it when it comes to the Korban Pesach, why don't we go by the spiritual reality and not necessarily by the physical reality? Why don't we follow the opinion of Shmuel and rather we follow the opinion of Rav Ada? So the Rebbe answers, the reason why we follow the opinion of Shmuel in those cases where we do, when it comes to the seasons, is because reality down here does not always reflect the reality up there. Why is that? Why is this misalignment? Because what happens down here is an imperfect reality, and it doesn't always mirror and reflect a higher, truer reality. And sometimes you have to therefore go by the reality the way it is up there, because the reality down here is not real. It's not true. It's not a reflection of it. That's when you're dealing with a physical phenomenon. But when you're dealing with Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering, the holiday of Pesach, you're dealing with a halachic concept. Halachic concept, you can't say it's not in alignment with what happens up there. That's why, when it comes to the Korban Pesach, the Rebbe says, we go by the opinion of Rav Ada, because we want to make sure that what happens down here is completely consistent with what happens up there. And the Rebbe also, I should mention, gave examples of where we see that reality down here is not always reflection of a reality up there. We find that in the laws of Edim Zomamin. The law is that if two witnesses testify about someone who committed a crime, and then another two witnesses come and perjure the first by telling them, you claimed to have been in a certain place at a certain time to witness this crime when you were in fact with us in another part of the country, and obviously you could not have seen the crime. The law is that they get the punishment that they wanted to have imposed on the person against whom they testified, provided, the Gemara says, that they didn't actually carry out the execution. If the person accused was actually executed, the perjured witnesses would not get that punishment, which is counterintuitive. If they wanted someone to be killed, they deserve to be punished. How much more so if they actually caused that person to be killed? And the commentaries answer, based on the Ramban, that the fact itself that the Bezdin allowed such a miscarriage of justice to occur proves that in reality this person was guilty. So even if the witnesses are not saying the truth, because they were not the ones to see the crime, the reality is that the person did commit the crime, and therefore they don't have to be punished for it. In other words, sometimes the reality is not the way it is down here. The reality is the way it is up there. And up there, the reality is that this person was guilty. And the Rabbi gives several other examples where the reality up there is not necessarily the same as what happens down here. And halacha sometimes tells us not to go by what we see, but what that higher the reality is. And the halacha determines when that applies. I believe it's the Satmar Rebbe in one of his writings, explains the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam has a very radical view about Shkia, about sunset, which is inconsistent with our astronomical knowledge and our vision of reality. And the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur uses that argument, among other arguments, against the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam. So to defend Rabbeinu Tam's view, which many Jews follow to this day, he posits that sometimes things down here are not the reality that we go by a spiritual reality. So in our physical world, Shkia, sunset, is when we see and observe sunset. But in a higher world, sunset could be at a different time. I'd like to throw out the question whether this is consistent with what the Rebbe says. Could we apply what the Rebbe said about the sun, in the cycle of the sun, when it comes to the things that relate to the seasons, that we go by the opinion of Shmuel, which is not astronomical reality, but it's a higher reality? Could that be applied to the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, or perhaps it's a different category? I'd like to throw that out. If anyone would like to give me an answer, I'd be very happy to hear about it. Since we're talking about throwing things out to the public, I want to share a question that I was asked on what I said last week. We were talking about the Rambam, who says that people at the Seder would say why we eat the Korban Pesach, then maror, then matzah. Why maror before matzah? Matzah is more important, it's biblical, even when there's no Korban Pesach, and matzah is certainly a higher obligation than maror. Why is maror mentioned first? And in the Mishnah Torah itself, he mentions it in the same order that we do, first matzah, then maror. So my answer was that maror has no status of its own, it's only subordinate to the Korban Pesach, whereas matzah has its own status. And the question that I was asked was, but that's not true. Matzah has also the subordinated status that the maror has. Matzah has two components to it. Number one, it's part of the mitzvah of eating the Korban Pesach with matzah, with maror, and it also is independent. And even if you don't have a Korban Pesach, you still eat matzah biblically. I think I went back and I think I said that clearly, that matzah has its own status in addition to it being subordinated. But the question was then why matzah should be mentioned later when matzah has two things and maror only has one. And I think the person, and I realized in talking to him, missed my point. And if I didn't make my point clear, I apologize for that. But my point is not that maror is more important than matzah, therefore it goes first, but that maror only has its inferiority, that it's only an extension of Pesach. So when you're talking about Pesach, maror fits in very nicely. Matzah stands on its own two legs, so to speak. It has its own independent status as well. So to point out that matzah is unique, and it's not just an extension of the Karban Pesach, matzah is mentioned separately. And also in the pasuk on matzah marorim yechluhu, someone pointed out to me, yechlu goes on marorim, that the maror is more of the subordinated entity to the Karban Pesach. At any rate, if anyone has any questions, always feel free to raise them. I'll be happy to try to address them, and wherever I have to correct what I said, I'd be very happy to do so. Meanwhile, everyone have a good week. We're in the 3 weeks, and these 3 weeks are weeks of auspicious times, and they will imminently be transformed into days of rejoicing and happiness, as the prophet says, quoted by the Rambam in the end of the laws of fast, which we learned, which we will learn very soon in the halachas of. Which we will learn, as I was right the first time, after we finish Hilchos Kiddush Hachodesh.